Not many people know that St. John Bosco had to deal with a terrible cholera epidemic. It was so bad that it even affected the produce. Let's see how he navigated these struggles. The Miracles and Prophecies of St. John Bosco, a project of America Needs Fatima. I'm your host, Matthew Miller. There were several times when Don Bosco helped to transport cholera patients. On the morning of August 16th, the feast of Saint Roch, who is the co-patron saint of Turin, Don Bosco approached the Oratory. He saw a young man devouring a large melon while sitting on the bank of a ditch in the Filippi brothers' fields. "Take it easy," Don Bosco said. "The melon might be contaminated and might hurt you," because cholera could be spread by contaminated produce, among many other ways. "This melon tastes so good that it can't harm me," replied that young man. "I'm the one causing it harm." Don Bosco again urged him to stop, but the man wouldn't. So he went on to the oratory, but had not yet reached his room when a boy came to tell him that a poor workman was in pain in the meadow and was asking for help. Don Bosco immediately went to the young man. But it was the same young man. He had not listened to Don Bosco's advice and was now groaning and writhing with half his melon still sitting beside him. Some onlookers were watching him in fear from afar, and no one dared to approach. Don Bosco tried to comfort him and asked, "What's the matter with you?" "I don't know," the youth said. "I feel cold and I have a chill in my bones." Don Bosco felt the young man's hands, which were like ice, a sure symptom of the deadly disease of cholera. So he invited the poor man to get up and come with him, but despite his efforts, the youth had to sit down, saying, "My legs no longer support me." Don Bosco looked about for help, and providentially, Tomatis was passing by. The two lifted the sick man under the armpits and set off. For some time, the youth could only drag his feet as he tried to walk, but at some point, he was assailed by the cramps and pains of cholera so severely that he dropped to the ground like a body that was already dead. Don Bosco and Tomatis gripped each other's wrists to form a seat for him and put him upon it. "Where are you taking me?" the poor man asked. "Nearby to the house of a friend of mine where you will be looked after," answered Don Bosco. He didn't clarify that they were headed right to the medical clinic because that might frighten him. Meanwhile, as they went along, the sick man dropped the melon he still held in his hands and wanted to stop and pick it up. Seeing that Don Bosco was tired, Tomatis lifted the sick man across his shoulders and carried him the rest of the way. Don Bosco followed, supporting the poor man from behind so he wouldn't be too uncomfortable. At the clinic, the nurses saw the gravity of the case and immediately prepared a hot bath. In the meantime, Don Bosco invited the young man to confess and prepare himself to die. With little to no preparation, the poor man confessed as best he could, but with true repentance. Immediately, he became delirious, talking about his melon and 8 pennies hidden in his sack. He feared that some thieving hand would take his belongings away from him. Don Bosco asked if he wished them to keep his coins for him, and the young man calmed down and gave him his little treasure, saying, "Keep them for me until I am cured." Meanwhile, the doctor arrived. The young man was put in a hot bath and massaged, but it was all in vain, for he died by noon. The contagious disease required continuous sacrifices of corporal and spiritual charity, and Don Bosco could hardly meet all the needs. At times, only the youngest, weakest, or the most timid were available to help whenever the boys volunteered to serve as nurses. Don Bosco needed helpers to accompany him wherever he was urgently needed. One morning he had to go to the clinic to anoint patients with holy oil. He wanted someone to carry the sacred vessels while administering the sacrament for convenience. But none of the young men who remained in the oratory dared to accompany him. After some had refused, Don Bosco invited John Cholera, who was then playing with his companions. "Do you want to go with me?" Don Bosco asked. "Let's go," replied Cholera resolutely, and immediately they set out. Then, having reached the clinic, Cholera helped Don Bosco prepare to administer the holy oil and made the responses during the prayers as they went from one bed to another. A doctor saw the young man and said, "Don Bosco, what are you doing? This young man can't stay here. You're being very careless." "No, doctor," replied Don Bosco. "Neither he nor I fear cholera. nothing will happen. Cholera could match any skilled nurse in both courage and skill. So could John Baptist Anfrossi, who wrote, "I had the good fortune to accompany Don Bosco on several visits to the sick. I was only 14 years old, and when I offered my services as a nurse, I felt great tranquility arising from my hope of being saved, which Don Bosco instilled in his pupils. I was also comforted by Don Bosco's charity. I experienced such tenderness to see how he induced the sick, with his friendliness and charity, to receive the sacraments, and how he reassured them about the faith of the poor children and those who would remain without support. One day I saw him return to the oratory, leading as many as 16 children he had collected from households here and there. These were children whose parents had orphaned them, so he kept them all with him and then introduced them to either studies or a trade according to their aptitude. These were not the only ones he tearfully drew by the hand and delivered into the loving arms of divine providence." A few days later, the examples of Cholera and Fossi and others motivated those who had not yet found the courage to volunteer. Don Bosco returned from the city, and those who had remained in the oratory huddled around him. Finally, he exclaimed, "Who wants to go to the clinic and into homes to assist the cholera patients?" "Me, me," they all shouted, bursting with charity. He then addressed that question directly to Felix Raviglio. Felix was the only one who didn't volunteer because he wanted Don Bosco to command him to volunteer. With a smile, Don Bosco seemed to agree to leave him alone. But as if he read Felix's heart, he quickly chose Felix to accompany him. Called by Don Bosco, the boy went to work, assisting 6 cholera patients until they died. John Turchi and Carlo Gastini also participated in these vigils with Don Bosco. But Cleric Rua, Cleric Giuseppe Buzzetti, and Cleric Francesca stood out in a special way because of their continuous service. Don Bosco prayed continually for the health of all his children, and Our Lady granted him his request, proving her maternal protection by way of Cleric Francesca. The disease had fiercely struck down the mother of this good cleric. Her son Francesca ran home and found her in a state that gave him little hope. Hastening back to the oratory, he called Don Bosco, who quickly went to hear her confession. She lived opposite the Church of Our Lady of Consolation. Don Bosco stood in front of the column of the Immaculate Conception in the square, uncovered his head, and showed Cleric Francesca the statue of Mary. "Do you see her?" Don Bosco asked him. "She will heal your mother if you promise to consecrate yourself to spreading devotion to her when you become a priest." The cleric accepted. Don Bosco then went to the sick woman, where he consoled her, heard her confession, and administered extreme unction. The doctor said the only remedy for this illness was bleeding, which was a popular procedure at that time, where a doctor would pierce a sick person's arm and allow blood to run out for a while. The practice was thought to rebalance the body and promote recovery at that time. The neighborhood women who had crowded into the room criticized the doctor's order and insisted that the sick woman not allow herself to be bled. The doctor said, "I never draw blood unless the sick person allows it," and he left. Cleric Francesca then cleared the room. Filled with faith in the word of Don Bosco, he asked his mother, "What shall we do then?" The good woman said, "What is your opinion, my son?" "I think we should do what the doctor suggested," he answered. "Then call him back." The son caught up with the doctor at the foot of the stairs and begged him to return, assuring him that his mother fully deferred to his advice. The doctor bled the woman 5 or 6 times, and she miraculously recovered and lived another 21 years. Thank you all so much for watching this 3-part series on the cholera epidemic in Turin. And if you'd like to become a monthly promoter of St. John Bosco, please click on the link I've put on the screen. It would really help us out a lot. God bless you, and Our Lady keep you. Ready to go? Let's go.